Okay, we're now live. Welcome everybody. I see some people starting to log in. We like to open up the room a bit early so that you can get your speakers adjusted properly, and that if you have any questions, you can always let us know through the chat box. I'm going to enable chatting for all attendees here, so let us know where you're from and where you're logging in and watching from, and what you're interested in hearing more about today. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the session for about 15 minutes, and Cindy Heitzman and myself will be moderating the Q&A for our speakers today. So if you have any questions, we recommend that you use the Q&A box or button in Zoom. If you're on social media right now, you can simply type in your question into the comment box, and I'll keep an eye for any questions coming through there. Closed captioning is pretty easy for you to enable. If you'd like to use it, there's a CC button on the bottom of your screen. You can enable that at any time. We will be making a recording of today's program in full, so you can find the recording on our YouTube channel or Facebook video channel, and we'll try to share the link to these options at the conclusion of today's program. Today's program is going to be an hour in length with three groups of speakers, and then we'll have time for questions, of course, at the end. So welcome everybody, and we will start here in about 2 minutes. Welcome to today's program. I'm John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. And I have with me here today Cindy Heitzman, the Executive Director of CPF. And between the two of us, we're going to kick off today's program. I just wanted to first mention that this is part 3 of our 3-part series on enlightenment, illusion, and inspiration. This is the inspiration part of it. We get to see some amazing work done at historic religious sites. We have 3 speakers today. But before we move on to the speakers and introduce the first speaker today, I wanted to mention that this is part of our annual appeal and also our annual auction. Cindy's going to talk a little more about our annual appeal. I'm going to talk about our annual auction. So today's program, there are a number of auction items that we encourage people to take a look at on our website. It's at californiapreservation.org/bid. The one I'm really excited about myself is the Gamble House tour. It's a private tour it's not a religious site, but I would call it a religious experience, seeing this wonderful green and green structure in Pasadena. And it's a private tour. It's a very rare opportunity. So we encourage you to go to californiapreservation.org/bid to learn more about all of the auction items. There's probably about 40 auction items up there now, and bidding closes on Friday at 8 p.m. So you only have one more day to make your bids. So we hope you'll do so, and it helps support our programming and our mission, which is to preserve and protect historic places in California. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, and then I can introduce this first speaker after that.
Thanks, John. And thank you for putting in a plug for the auction. I'd also like to put in a plug for one of the auction items that's near to me, where I live. Is the DeRosa Preserve and Scribe Winery. And wonderful experience at the DeRosa Preserve, which is the largest collection of Northern California art in the world. Wonderful place. With that, I'd also like to remind everyone that this time of year, we are asking our supporters to support the work that we do by making an end-of-year gift. You can do that online at californiapreservation.org/give. You'll be able to, I think we have some slides at the end, so we'll put in a reminder at the end, but I'm going to turn it back over to John so we can start our program today.
Great. And so the first of our three speakers today is Miss Brenda Levin. And Brenda is an architect, fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and she worked on the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles, and which won a design award, I believe, in 2016. Maybe Cindy can correct me, but won a design award from the Preservation Foundation for its exceptional work on this historic religious structure, this historic synagogue. So Brenda, feel free to turn your video on if you're able to. Welcome, Brenda. And so Brenda will be speaking about her work on the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and then we'll follow that with another project at the temple site that we'll talk more about later. But Brenda, feel free to kick it away.
This one? Yes. Hey, thanks, John and Cindy. Appreciate it. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we see it. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I will try to move quickly through these slides and start with some original construction photos of the temple. Just quickly, this is the third home of Wilshire Boulevard Temple in the city of Los Angeles. It was built in 1929, and it is basically attributed to three major Hollywood moguls: the Warners, the DeMilles, and the Thalbergs, who were major donors to the temple. It's described as exterior as Byzantine. I think one could argue that it probably is a conglomeration of styles. So I'm going to move through, if I can. So, sorry, it's not advancing. Cameron?
Oh yeah, did you try clicking in the center of the slide?
Not advancing.
Oh.
There.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, stay here. We'll start with some historic images, basically the entry points to the historic sanctuary. Oh, sorry. And images of what the temple looked like before we began restoration and renovation. It's 100-foot in diameter dome, 100 feet tall, and it was absolutely brilliantly designed on the interior by A.M. Edelman, who was the architect for the building, in terms of the use of rich materials, walnut and gilded metals, as well as painted coffered ceilings. Of course, with every historic building, the first thing that we want to look at is how it is going to handle itself in a earthquake, and it obviously had survived several earthquakes, but we did do a stress model, and actually the blue is the area in which improvements needed to be made. So you see new shear walls identified in the octagonal shape on the angled walls, and new columns inserted between the stained glass windows east and west of the from the interior east and west. So those were some of the first efforts. These are the shear walls going in. Obviously, we had to go down to the basement level, put new foundations, and then weave the reinforcing bars to make the shear walls. Part of the issue at Wilshire Boulevard Temple is that the whole interior has very historic character defining features and materials. So in determining where the shear walls could go, we obviously wanted to go in an area where we could replace those historic materials more easily. The other issue was the dome repair and restoration, and then the plenum, which was used to cool the sanctuary from the very beginning. Of course, we know historically that the way they did that was to put blocks of ice and blow fans over them with holes in the floor and use the plenum to circulate air up through the building. That created a whole bunch of issues. In the upper right-hand corner, all of the efflorescence was identified in the dome, and obviously we'll see some real hazardous materials that found their way up to the dome. But the holes, existing vents in the underfloor plenum are reused in our new scheme, which has, in addition to the historic preservation, all new infrastructure. So we're now working on a platform about 50 feet above the sanctuary for the first analysis of the dome itself. It's the first time anybody's seen the dome in probably since 29. Evidence of the efflorescence, the damaged plaster coffer ceiling, and then a fair amount of dust, dirt, and grime, all the brown color. And you see that everybody's in a hazmat suit because that dirt has a lot of lead in it. Obviously, in the day up until the late 60s, early 70s, when we had catalytic converters, the amount of lead in this dirt was substantial. It was also the first time that we could really look at the coffered ceiling and see that it's perforated panels, an acoustic treatment that was used, and to try to identify the original color scheme. We got all the way up to the top of the dome, and there's a beautiful oculus. It does not open to the outside, but it simulates an exterior environment. So this is the prayer, the most important prayer in the Jewish religion, the Shema, and the condition of it in terms of the gilding and the paint on the left prior to the restoration on the right. This is the picture of the dome when it's been completed. So that's the oculus that I was talking about. It's sort of a Pantheon reference. It is a blue light. It is a double dome, concrete dome on the exterior, and the suspended plaster dome on the interior. And we had to take a sort of a guesstimate on the color scheme, as we were really not able to recover much of the original colors. I'd say one of the biggest challenges or concerns that I had was I made those decisions at 50 feet up in the air, and I didn't see the end result until the scaffolding came down. So you hold your breath and hope that you made the right decision. The light fixtures are modeled, they're original, they're modeled after the spice box, a icon used at the end of Shabbat, where you put spices in a box and smell them for the sweet week ahead. These are 13 feet long. They're on winches up in between the plaster dome ceiling and the concrete dome. They were restored by coal lighting. First up was to remove them and crate them and get them to coal lighting, to be improved as well. Obviously, they were all switched out to LED lighting, and we augmented the fixtures with some uplighting to enhance the dome and enhance the beaded chain that suspends the light fixtures. They're really quite spectacular. Although in the Jewish religion, in the Second Amendment, we're not encouraged to display human figures in a sanctuary. It sort of refers back to praying to idols in the early centuries. But because so much of this building was inspired by Edgar Magnin, who was a larger-in-life rabbi at the time and who encouraged a more modernization approach to the Jewish religion and particularly reform, he believed that these murals that surround the sanctuary really were appropriate for a more modern interpretation of the Second Amendment. So we have, from the very beginning, we start with Genesis and move around the entire sanctuary with the history of the Jewish people up until 1929. And clearly it misses two important moments in the history of the Jewish people. One is which is coming to America, and the other is the Holocaust and the formation of the State of Israel. The blue paint color was a bit of a challenge to try to replicate. With the help of analysis, we were able to come close. Rayner and Zabala were the muralists who restored the Ballin murals, touch-up painting, infill painting, reapplication of the canvas that was attached to the building. Ballin painted most of these murals in his studio. As most of you probably know, he was a set designer and a painter for Warner Brothers, and the Warners were major contributors to the temple. So these are called the Warner murals. There were a couple of places where grills were inserted as feeding the air circulation system in the temple that we no longer needed. So we were able to infill those areas and bring the original mural back to its entirety. One of the things that I loved about this, at the back of the sanctuary, the four matriarchs were represented in the murals. The conservators used paint that is clearly identified with the 20th century, 21st century, and differentiated from the original paint used, so that in future conservation efforts, there'll be the ability to determine what was original and what was repaired in the restoration. The rose window was one of the major challenges. It obviously faces Wilshire Boulevard. It was identified as a falling hazard. One of the first things that we had to do was to remove it and put in a temporary window. Everybody was totally challenged by this effort. The removal of the stained glass was executed by Judson Studios. The removal of the cast concrete surround came down in multiple pieces, about 110. And the glass itself was decamed and then recamed, and any pieces that were missing were replaced or cracked pieces repaired. We have beautiful rubbings of those windows that now are going to find their way to the Getty. To reinforce the concrete surround, the structural engineer came up with a dual ring system, stainless steel rings, which meant that the actual spokes and surrounds had to be cored, as you see in the upper left-hand corner, to create the reinforcement and to reinstall the cast stone. So it got replaced and restored, cleaned, and reinforced, and then reinstalled in about 100 sections. After the cast stone was restored, the stained glass was reinstalled. And you see in the upper left-hand corner what it looked like when we started on the effort, and the lower and the right-hand side obviously restored. One of the other issues in the temple itself was access to the bima, which is the platform in which sit the Torahs, that's the Ark. And no disabled access was designed into the original scheme. There was always a two-part bima, two-level bima, so we used the lower bima and extended it and created ramps up the side and steps from the front. One of the interesting things that you'll see about the sanctuary is that it has no center aisle, which makes weddings a little bit challenging in the sanctuary. But because it was designed by the moguls of the film industry, their point of view, and it's documented, is why would you interrupt the best seats in the house with a center aisle? So it's very much a reflection of who was involved in the design of the temple. A tremendous amount of gold leaf, and this is actual gold leaf, not gold paint. All of the gold leaf had tarnished beyond recognition. It was sort of brown and dusty and dirty. It's all been restored. One of the challenges was the material zenitherm, which was developed in the 30s and 40s. It lined the ambulatory around the sanctuary. This is the area where we actually put the shear walls, and so we had to replace some of the panels that were broken in the removal. It took about a year to figure out how to create what looked like zenitherm using modern materials. But we were able to do that. Obviously, one of the design features here is to make the zenitherm panels look like stone with the articulation of the joints. This is the Wilshire Boulevard lobby, pretty much as it was in 1929, with the exception of the removal of some materials that were added in the 80s and 90s. All of the light fixtures, all of the historic light fixtures were removed, cleaned, and restored and relamped. We now get to the outside of the building. One of the first things that we did was to do a master conservation plan, to do an analysis of the exterior of the building and document all of the deficiencies in the materials. In order to access the basement of the structure and to incorporate the mechanical system, a large opening was created on the east side of the building. These are images for some of the reports that SGH did in terms of documenting cracks and potential falling hazards that you see in the upper left-hand corner. Cast stone and plaster are the major materials on the exterior of the building. It was painted several times, the plaster, and we did remove all of the paint from later generations. The base of the building is marble, and much of it was cracked or falling off, which we had to replace. The other is that it had turned a very, very pale gray, and we wanted to restore it back to, when we saw historic photos, these dark bands of marble. So they were honed and then sealed with a penetrating sealer. So the exterior of the building, you can see these black stripes now, the black base in its entirety, a really strong element around the perimeter of the building. Each one of the entrances, both the white marble and the black marble, were honed and sealed, and the entire building was painted with a Kime paint to last generations. One of the things that was very evident, and I'm sure that Jake will get into this as well, was the access to the building. The Wilshire Boulevard access is only used on major occasions, the High Holy Days. Now with the garage at 6th and Hobart, between Hobart and Harvard, most people are entering from the back of the building through the corridor system. However, after a service, rather than exiting onto Wilshire Boulevard, we enhanced the east entry and created a new courtyard there, which has now gotten incorporated into the new project. But on your right, you see the areaway that was the existing condition with a major transformer at the end, and then the courtyard that we created. So finally, pictures of the sanctuary of the building after restoration. The lighting was done by Francis Cray. The exterior lighting is really quite spectacular, particularly the dome, and the entry to the Wilshire Boulevard lobby with the doors open and lighting on all of the cast stone. So the entire building has been touched, every element, every surface. to hopefully last for the next generation. And I just should say some of the infrastructure challenges in terms of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, or that this is a holy space, a spiritual space. And so creating a quiet space was also integral to our design effort. All of the mechanical equipment is in the basement of the building. The plenum is completely lined with acoustic treatment, and all of the plumbing and other infrastructure that is attached to the underside of the concrete slab or the concrete plenum sanctuary floor are on acoustic hangers. So it is a very quiet space and a very spiritual and contemplative space. So I think I've managed to beat my 15 minutes, but I'm happy to pass it along.
Thank you, Brenda. That was very enlightening. So next we have Jake Forster with OMA, who did work on the new Audrey Irmas Pavilion at the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and he's going to talk about his work as an architect on that team. So Jake, feel free to share your screen now, and we look forward to hearing more about this new structure.
You. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Perfect. All right, great. I will begin. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's an interesting discussion, I think, relative to preservation, given the kind of new building, but hopefully you'll see how we kind of approached the kind of design. And we started with a competition in 2015, which was really on the heels of kind of Brenda's kind of work to the existing temple. So there was a lot of, in a way, awareness and I think sensitivity to wanting to have a building which could complement and augment it. So a little bit, I will go through kind of quickly slides through the building and context. But to begin with, as you know, the temple itself is located on Wilshire Boulevard, which is, of course, a very significant artery through LA, which is connecting a series of obviously very important districts. So the prominence of the kind of both the temple and the new building it was not lost. This is the kind of photograph in 1929 after the completion of that temple, and obviously the context itself has changed a lot since then, with kind of more high-rise buildings being located on the south side of Boulevard itself. So when we started on the project, the site itself was actually a surface parking lot, and there had been a kind of study which Brenda had been looking at in terms of how to kind of begin to reconnect the master plan, which I'll show you here. And the kind of thinking was about how to create a campus in conjunction with the temple, and to reorientate, I guess, the circulation from kind of parking lot that was located on the north portion of the site through almost a kind of axial spine, which runs just to the east of the temple itself and would be the west of the new building. So it was already important to begin with to create something and a building which really interfaced on that kind of west-east corridor with the existing temple. And the site itself is in a way kind of interesting, given that there's a very civic side on Wilshire itself, but towards the north, the kind of context is much more neighborhood. And this new space, which was from the brief called the gathering space, was really an intention to try and kind of connect those two parts. So to create something both for the campus itself, but also for the wider context. The program of that kind of building was a series of variety of different event spaces and then flexible meeting spaces that could be combined to be used, as I said, by the kind of entirety of the campus, but also the surrounding community. The first question, of course, which we were kind of really challenged with was, how do you create a building which can really complement the kind of temple? And I think that's a kind of very, it's a fine balancing act. You don't want a building to be kind of to overall the temple, but at the same time, you also want to give the temple a level of respect by having a building which is in a way of a certain level of grandeur, such that it really complements the temple itself. The temple, as you know, has in a way almost different orientations, not only on Wilshire, but as Brenda mentioned, on the east side as well. So its ability to be able to engage in kind of multiple orientations was also very critical. We start, as we always started, by looking at a series of different massing opportunities that could begin to create different relationships with the temple, but sort of landed on a kind of fairly simple kind of volume, which started with just a simple box, its height limited so that you will always see the dome of the temple from across and down the street. But to that volume, we pushed the building away at the top from the temple on the west side as a kind of almost sign of respect, and then pushed the building back off Wilshire to create a kind of entry zone, and away from the north, where there was a kind of historic school and courtyard space. So here you can see that the kind of relationship. This is, as Brenda was mentioning, this kind of new almost courtyard space between the two buildings, which allows for access into both buildings, both the temple and the new pavilion. You can see on the west side how the building form slopes away to create almost air between the two buildings and the temple itself. And how it pushes back off the street so that the temple maintains a prominence, but there is nevertheless almost a kind of peak of the existing of the new building visible along Wilshire as you're driving down. Here towards the back, the north side, you can see how the building leans away from the kind of campus and the historic courtyard and school space to create a kind of allow for more light to be there. And I think in addition to that volume, you can see here on the right, we created a series of 3 void spaces, one at the base for the event space, on the second floor, chapel space, and the top of sunken garden, which were all about providing kind of new connections, both to the context, but also back to the temple and the campus itself. These 3 spaces are almost a kind of series of vertically stacked event spaces. So the building itself as a gathering space really manifests itself stacked vertically. On almost every floor, there's an opportunity for sizable gatherings. These event spaces are then kind of interlinked with the skylight, so almost also a vertical access, and are then treated differently with different kind of materials, which you'll see take also relationships to the temple itself. So they begin to kind of interlock almost these spaces. And I think there's also a kind of a program use of these, that they could be used independently or they could be used also all together. So the lowest level, the event space on the ground floor, we wanted to create a kind of simple space which perhaps spoke to, in a way, the kind of primitive nature of the dome as a kind of shape or space as itself. So an arch space which connects from Wilshire then to the courtyard at the north of the side. It's almost as if the dome space is in a way sunken, so you have a moment actually to engage with the kind of architecture. And of course, in LA, there's a lot of comparables of these arch spaces, be it the station or the Hollywood Bowl or even the kind of tunnel system as well. So creating a kind of large, almost barrel vault-like kind of space that could be almost civic in its nature, that connects directly from Wilshire, as I said, through to the courtyard, historic school courtyard, so that you can begin to engage with the building both from the campus at the back, but also the front as it addresses the street. So here is how we had imagined that connection towards the historic courtyard space. And here are the kind of photos of that. You can see how that kind of building really creates an openness then to the kind of courtyard space around. On the second floor, as I mentioned, is a chapel space, which is again also a multi-purpose flexible space. And here we wanted to frame the clear story window of the temple. So it's really positioned, this void is in the center of the building to frame that chapel window. So through various views, both from exterior, you can see and frame the chapel window, but also from the interior where there's a courtyard space, a terrace space. It also begins to allow for perhaps a new form of engagement with the existing temple space, beginning to almost understand its architecture at different heights. And then we get to the top where there's a sunken garden, which is almost thought of as a kind of inverse of the dome, a kind of circular space that begins to have perhaps some harmony to the dome. The roof itself, of course, being as high as it is, also allows for, I think, an interesting vantage of the dome, which up until now is only usually kind of seen from the ground. So some then other views of that. I will quickly go through some of these critical spaces. So the ground floor event level, as I mentioned, is a series of kind of barrel vaults with a series of steps, which I will explain to allow for views into the space. The space itself was envisaged as being a kind of hyper flexible event space that could be used really from anything from exhibitions to banquets to lectures, etc. So flexibility was kind of very critical. We created this sort of step section around the perimeter to really allow for an engagement of the perimeter. So creating a series of almost balconies that could be integrated in the architecture as well as catwalks, as if almost the kind of historical notion of a theater box is turned almost on its side. So here is the kind of image of that main space. We lined it with the kind of wood, the sisanda wood, which of course its hue and its golden tone maybe is kind of somewhat reminiscent of the dome space itself. We wanted to have something which felt in a way somewhat timeless with its interior, some other views. And you can see here beyond to the historic courtyard space beyond. So here is the step section. As I mentioned, there are a series of balconies and then integrated catwalks. Within it, that includes things like speakers that we integrated within the arches themselves. And from the base of this event space, we also created a skylight that could then begin to frame the dome of the temple itself, so that you always have a connection back to the historic temple, and in a way, the kind of origins of the campus itself. At both the front and the back, as I mentioned, a series of spill out spaces and almost pre-function exterior, which we thought was very important given the climate, that these event spaces could actually spill out and engage with the exterior. So both at the front facing Wilshire and, as I mentioned, at the rear, the courtyard. The circulation space, the main kind of entry to the building is really on this western access point, is immediately adjacent to the east connection to the temple itself. And here you can see we created this kind of large courtyard space for access to both buildings. And from here, you can go directly almost into the event space. The kind of pre-function space is almost thought of as being a vertically stacked pre-function, like a series of step terraces that connect you then up onto the chapel level. So there's a series of stairs that almost reminiscent of almost a kind of Indian stepwell here from the ground floor that then connect you up to these series of viewing balconies and then up onto the chapel level itself. So these stepped connections, and here you can see these stairs that the kind of within almost this atrium space, which of course this kind of thin facade with its dynamic reading has then views through to the temple. Here you can see the windows that you can then look down into the event space as well. So then kind of as you connect up, you begin to move up to the chapel level on the second floor, which, as I mentioned, is a very flexible space for about 200 people in the chapel, and likewise also the terrace. There's large sliding windows that allows for the kind of inside, outside openness between the two spaces. And then there's a series of meeting rooms which complement those spaces. Again, like the lower event space, the space is intended to be very flexible and to be used in conjunction with this terrace. So here's the outdoor shaded terrace. And, you know, I think what was interesting is as we've kind of framed this clear story window, there's a kind of opportunity to begin to illuminate it. So we actually illuminated the window kind of in a way post-fact, having seen the kind of opportunity to do that. So here is the terrace, and it's lined with a glass, which we put a kind of green in a way mesh in it, which begin to maybe relate to the kind of copper hue of the dome itself. Here, connection to the courtyard. So here's some of the meeting rooms. And then on the top level, we work closely with the Annenberg Foundation for Space for Healthy Aging. It's a series of spaces which create a variety of different uses, from art to fitness to multi-purpose spaces, all centered around the large sunken kind of courtyard space in the center here. So there's kind of in a way light, which is activating the space. And then there are views both into this sunken courtyard for kind of contemplation, but also back towards the temple itself. And then at the top of the building, as I jump up there, is then the roof. So that's connected to the sunken garden via a stair here. And the roof is meant to be a kind of very flexible space. It can also be used as an event. So it's in a way a kind of third almost event space. And as I mentioned, there's a kind of strong, in a way, dialogue we wanted to create with the temple of the dome temple that allows you maybe to interact with it in ways we hadn't previously envisaged. So here are some of those relationships, and zooming out so you can see the building in perhaps its context. The facade, very briefly, we wanted to create a facade which in a way was in a way unified, to create something which felt simple as a reading, as a mass, like the temple itself, but were inspired by, of course, the kind of geometric patterns within the temple campus itself, and of course the dome, which is comprised of these series of kind of octagon to create this continuous pattern. We tested a lot of course, different versions of doing that, but arrived on using a hexagon, which, as you know, is a kind of almost inscribes sort of triangles inside, to create almost a lattice that works around the building, to create then a series of kind of windows and openings which could begin to respond to what's happening on the interior, but do so in a way which allow for a building which appears to be cohesive and in a sense monolithic. So each of these kind of almost different apertures has a different function, from windows to shadow boxes to louvers, etc., which we carefully coordinated with the interior of the building to create both a series of views and for the orientation of these windows to begin to react to the angle of the form of the building itself. The panels were made out of GRC, and it was very important to make sure that the color of the panels matched that of the temple. We also created a series of ribs that reinforce the direction, so that at different moments of the day, the building itself appears to be somewhat dynamic or not. So here you can see the kind of relationship and the kind of hue. So this is just a kind of finish with a quick kind of overview, so you can really maybe understand the kind of building and its context to the temple. Here, the chapel, how it frames the clear story window. And the significance of always allowing the dome to be present. Just a quick note, just in terms of the process with the city, the building itself was really kind of on the heels, as I mentioned, of a master plan that was done by Brenda in around, I guess, 2015-16, that had been approved as a EIR process. And so the idea of having a building there was not new. We started, though, with discussions with the Historic Resource Group in terms of how our building related to that initial massing, which in a way was very similar in terms of its bulk. And then closely worked with the kind of Cultural Heritage Commission through a series of, in a way, kind of discussions and approval process to work through the final design of the building.
Great. Thank you very much, Jake. That was enlightening. It just really shows how much thought went into the project and how much reverence you had for the historic structure. So thank you for that. That was very enlightening. So now we're going to turn it over finally to Reverend Dr. Malcolm Young from Grace Cathedral. And this is kind of we're going to slightly change topics here, because I think what we want to talk about is how these religious structures are able to involve the community in new and engaging ways. And I personally have been to Grace Cathedral during its sound bath events, which is always a lot of fun. And I hear you also have a lot of other public programs that engage the community in many different ways. So Malcolm, we'd love to hear more about that.
Thanks so much, John. My name is Malcolm Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral. It's a delight to be on. I'm going to talk a lot more about how we use our building rather than how it was constructed. But some important background is that the building, the congregation itself was formed in 1849 And so, the name San Francisco itself was it was only, from 1848 or 1847. So we really, as an institution, grew up with the city of San Francisco, and there's been a lot of mutual connection and influence, both in the city and the cathedral. So you'll see that. This building that we're showing you right now is the current Grace Cathedral. Grace was originally founded as Grace Church by John Vermeer. He was a Dutch immigrant. And when he first came to San Francisco, he was actually, one of the first things he did was he was the chaplain when they hanged a bunch of people who mutinied off of one of the ships in the bay. So it shows, that gold rush, the first collection that the church ever had, there were little envelopes that had gold dust in it. And this is, as I say, the fourth building. So in the 1870s and 1880s, Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, described Grace Church as Grace Cathedral because he thought that it was a kind of a pretentious bunch, and the building was very pretentious. But the pretentious building that we had in the latter part of the 19th century was destroyed by the earthquake and fire of 1906. So we have a mural in the building that commemorates that. And then this building itself was built on the site of the Crocker Mansion. So there were two Crocker Mansions on the top of Nob Hill in San Francisco, and that's the site. Immediately after the earthquake, within like a year, we'd already approached the Crockers and asked them for the site. And then we began building. The cornerstone was laid in 1910. And then the Chapel of Grace was built in the 1920s. We built half the building through the 1930s. And then the church took a very strong stand on behalf of labor unions. And we had a major donor who basically said, you can either support the labor unions or I'll finish building the building. And we chose the labor unions. And so from roughly the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s, the building was only half completed. So from the very ceiling all the way to the floor, there was kind of a corrugated tin roof material that it's very cold in the building. And then in the early 1960s, we were able to connect with the bell tower. The northern bell tower was built earlier because Dr. Colson, a famous dentist, gave the bells in Grace Cathedral. They were at the Pan American Fair, and then we built the bell tower. So it was kind of standing independent, and we built the rest of the building to reach the bell tower in the 1960s. Social justice and activism is a really deep part of our DNA. So not just supporting the dock workers, but we've been very involved in women's ordination. One of the first women who was ordained to the diaconate was ordained here at Grace Cathedral. We've been very involved in race. Dr. Martin Luther King preached from the pulpit during the Selma marches. He came out to California and preached here, and it's had an important role in the life of LGBTQ plus people in the city also. So we were very involved in AIDS and the AIDS crisis, and we have an AIDS interfaith AIDS chapel, which is a really important part of our life together. So I'm going to show you a few more images of the cathedral. This is what the outside of the cathedral looks like. The two bell towers. That center rose window is from Gabrielle Loire, from the Gabrielle Loire Studios. It's a massive window. It's Val de Verre glass construction, so very thick stained glass window, and it has I think like 4,000 pieces of glass in it. It's a massive thing. And here's what the cathedral looks like. This was we had a wedding where we had this beautiful decoration of the Ghiberti doors. These Ghiberti doors are based on the doors that are in the baptistry in Florence, Italy. They're absolutely beautiful, and they're worth seeing. You don't even have to come into the building to see them. Then we have beautiful stained glass windows also. We have it's a huge part of the city. We put up banners for different city events and city things. We have a yearly theme, and so this is the theme that the year that we had Grace's Home as our theme. And this is after a funeral with the banners for St. Francis and for St. Thomas. So these are pictures of it's obviously used every day of the week for worship services. These are pictures of a worship service. This is a picture of Easter, so you get a sense for it. It's 100 feet high, the ceilings, and 300 feet long, the nave. from the apse to the Caberti doors. This is more on Easter. We also have a really important service in June. It's the major part of the Pride Month. So during Pride Week, we have a huge Pride Mass that can have as many as 1,000 people here for that service. So, regular worship services are a really big part of our life. We recently had a Requiem service on Sunday. We have 1,000 people who come, but we also do special artistic events. This is an artistic event with acrobats in the cathedral. It was an absolutely beautiful event, and it really makes use of the huge spaces and ceilings. To see somebody on a swing that goes like 100 feet. These are an art installation we had before a major dinner event with these doves that were paper doves along the front of the ceiling. Then we have like regular, more traditional church architecture and church art too. That's part of what we have to offer. This is Jim Hodges is a famous sculptor. He made a casting of a tree that he then made a bronze version of this tree. It's called Unearthed, and it was in the entire north transept for a considerable amount of time. So we often have art exhibits. This one weighed several tons, and it was, in order to fit through the doors, it had only about like 2 inches or an inch on either side in order to get it to fit. We had to cut off some of the branches, the roots, in order for it to fit in. And then this is another picture of some of the art in the baptismal font before nighttime engagement. And this is a new thing that we've just started having about a year before COVID. Illuminate, the company that lighted the Bay Bridge and has lighted the pink triangle on the Twin Peaks, has installed this beautiful experience for, we can take about 40 people per night or 40 people per session. And you lie down in a circle and look up through this beautiful tunnel of light with a score that's been especially composed for it. It's an amazing thing to be looking through a tunnel of light that's 100 feet tall. So we do that on Monday nights during the winter time. This is another projection that we showed on the inside of the massive transept window. We almost every year we have a period of time when we hang the AIDS quilt as part of the cathedral life. We've had a lot of people who've been involved with the quilt project who've been members of the cathedral, and so it's a really important part. We always have part of the AIDS quilt on display in the AIDS chapel, but during other parts of the year we hang them in other sections of the cathedral also. This is another piece of art that was made by Jim Campbell and Benjamin Bergery. It's a ladder called Jacob's Ladder. It's a video installation that's 70 feet long, so it's very large, but it's another sort of art that we have in the cathedral. And then another thing that's really important is the labyrinth. Anywhere in the world that you see a labyrinth design or see someone walking this labyrinth as a spiritual practice, the practice of walking the labyrinth really did start with Grace Cathedral. So priests at Grace Cathedral noticed the labyrinth pattern in Chartres Cathedral in France, and began to promote this as a way of as a kind of spiritual practice where you don't need to have a particular dogma or doctrine. All you need is very basic instructions in order to do it. So we have both an inside labyrinth and an outside labyrinth. This is a picture of two people walking the inside labyrinth. This is just regular Sunday. We have many people coming here, and I think this is one of the things that I think people find most interesting. We have a yoga practice that we think may be one of the largest yoga practices in the Northern Hemisphere. So we've had years where we had 500 or 600 people practicing yoga on Tuesday nights. We have musicians in the center of the labyrinth, and then we fill the entire building with yoga practitioners. It's a remarkable thing to see. So many people in their bodies in the same shape, doing the same thing. And then we talked a little bit at the very beginning about Sound Bath. So Sound Bath is a new program that we've been offering for about two years or so. And that too is on Monday nights. And we have musicians, our musicians that we use for yoga do the music for this. And it's an immersive experience. Some people sit in the pews, some people sit on other benches, some people sit cross-legged on the floors, other lie down. But it's beautiful wonderful, peaceful, relaxing music and a program that's available. We have several hundred people who participate in this every month, and it's a wonderful offering for people, because cathedrals really exist for all the people in the city, not just for people of one particular religious faith. And this is a picture of the musicians at Sound Bath, and here's the last Sound Bath picture. So the cathedral is used in many different ways, and it's evolving in how we do things. But we definitely feel very strongly about wanting to involve not just people who are coming here for church worship services on Sunday morning, but we want to involve people of all different kinds of spirituality, all different kinds of spiritual longings, and we feel really grateful to be a kind of hub for people to come to have and express their spiritual practices. But I've been paying attention and noticing that we have only 10 more minutes for questions for all the different presenters. So John, I'm just going to go ahead and cede the rest of my time for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I didn't realize how many programs you had going on there, so I'll have to attend more in the future. So at this point, I'm going to invite all of our panelists here for questions. And Cindy Heitzman, the executive director of CPF here, and myself will be co-moderating. And I'll start with the first question, and I think Cindy might have a question too. But my question is actually in relation to the Audrey Irmas Pavilion from Samantha, and she's asking if there were any influences. She noted that when Brenda made her presentation, she mentioned that there was the influence of Hollywood and sort of the Hollywood connection and cinema, but with the new project, Jake, was there any sort of influence in your thought process with that?
Well, I think, just as the temple back when it was built had a kind of congregants that really linked to Hollywood, now they're similarly a very rich kind of group of congregants that are part of the temple, and a lot of which have very strong ties to the cultural and art world. So I think that I would say that maybe not in a kind of explicitly literal sense, but the building was really intended to be something that could be very functional to allow for, in a way, different uses of the temple to be conceived there. So in a way, sort of flexible, depending on the way that the kind of temple wanted to begin to engage with it. So, for example, art exhibitions could happen there, or theater performances can happen there, or things that are maybe not necessarily envisaged as being solely religious. So it's about, in a way, trying to create a building that can also create a flexibility to open up to the community, right?
That's great. I think Cindy might have a question. I see one in the Q&A box. This is for Grace, for Dr. Young. And the question is, I didn't know if you wanted me to read it, Cindy, or if you'd like to read it. The question is, how does Grace welcome folks with mobility difficulties? Is the building accessible?
That's a great question. So it is accessible for ordinary people. And we did a great deal of work on making the Chapel of Grace accessible. My biggest issue right now is that the pulpit and the lectern are not accessible. And so we recently had one of our priests was in an accident and shattered her pelvis, and she was able to get around. But that's work that we definitely need to do still. So we have elevators to every floor in the administrative spaces, elevators to the parking structure, elevated to anything that you do for worship. But if you're a presenter, then if you're a priest, then we're not accessible.
Great. And I guess I'll take a question for Brenda, and then if Cindy has anything, I can turn it over to her. But my question is, so when I was doing the research for this program, I ran into a documentary entitled Restoring Tomorrow by Aaron Wolf, and I watched it, and it's just a stunning example of how one man reconnects to his religious history and his past and his family's history with a structure. But in the documentary, you're strongly featured, and I was wondering, I don't know if it's very difficult to cover all the aspects of a project in 15 minutes. So do you feel that documentaries like the one that Aaron did can help really kind of communicate the challenges of these projects? Because I'm sure you had many challenges that you weren't able to mention today, but do you think the documentary sort of conveys that? Or are there other ways that we can communicate the sort of the real challenges of taking a historic structure and making it fit for modern use? How do you see that best being communicated to people?
I think the film is a really great tool, but it is as much about a family history and connections to the temple through Aaron's grandfather, Rabbi Alfred Wolf, who was the rabbi for many, many, many years. But it is a terrific example, particularly the time lapse components of it. I think everybody's very engaged with the way you see a building be restored over a period of time. I think I neglected to mention that the first effort was a Getty grant to document the existing conditions of the building and the deficiencies and the deferred maintenance, all the things that we start out with. The other is that we have the advantage of having the original documents from A.M. Edelman to use as a base. But you're right, it's, I sometimes refer to it like dental work. I mean, there's an investigative phase, there's an analysis phase, there's then a treatment plan, and then there are mock-ups, and then you eventually get to actually do the work, and then you find things that you didn't know about, all the unforeseen conditions. And it's a combination of all the character defining features and the beautiful details in the building and the use of historic materials in unique ways, like the zenitherm to look like stone. That's very hard to describe in a short period of time. And the effort that it took to try to analyze that and replicate it is a story in and of itself. So preservation is one of those things where it's like an onion and you keep unfolding the layers, and to do that in a short period of time is really difficult. So to answer your question, all the technology that's available, from time lapse, from 3D photographs, from laser surveys, are all part of a preservation project.
Thank you, Brenda. That helps out a lot. Cindy, do you have any questions?
Well, just something I wanted to point out, Reverend Young, I believe that the stained glass large rose windows in the cathedral were restored recently, and
We actually didn't need to restore the rose window because of that special stained glass construction, but all the other windows on the south facing side of the cathedral were restored. So yeah, it was a massive project to restore all the stained glass.
right, yeah, I think we gave the presented an award for that work. I believe Zalani, is it Zalani Art Glass?
Yeah, it's and that is that we have other like rose type windows, and when they were installed, they're the largest windows west of the Mississippi, and they're very beautiful.
Yeah, well, I'm really want to let our viewers learn more about the events that you have in the cathedral. Can you give us a website where they can go to learn more? I know that I'm interested in it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's gracecathedral.org is the website. So Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California. Just have to Google that.
Fantastic. Thank you for providing these services. I think they're wonderful for the community.
Well, thanks, Cindy.
I just pasted the website into the chat box for everyone, and also somebody was asking for a link to the documentary, which I posted. Now, Dr. Young, I didn't realize how many programs you did, and I'm curious what your perspective is in terms of when the general public who are not religious come to the space. Do they ever give you any feedback in terms of how it helped them spiritually, in terms of the space itself being a sort of a spiritual experience, whether it's through sound or light or art or in other ways? And maybe you can give us some insight as to what sort of purpose it serves outside of your parishioners, how the public really responds to these. You're opening the doors to this space, this special space.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm going to give two quick stories about this. One is, we're online now. So more than 3 times as many people watch online as are in person. 6 times as many people hear the sermon online as in person. And so the other day, like 2 weeks ago after church, this woman comes up to me and she said, I completely know you. I know all about you. I watch you every week. And this is the first time I've ever been here. And then she said, I have been struggling during COVID and I decided to take my own life. And something that you said in a sermon stopped me. And she reached into her purse and she took out a printed version of a sermon I'd written that had been laminated. And so that's one quick story about just people who are online all of a sudden are experiencing the space, and it's transformative even if you just watch it on the screen. And the other example I'm going to use is I talked about that cone of light it's called grace light. And so everybody lies down on the hard floor in the middle of the labyrinth, looking up 100 feet into this and towards the ceiling, and it feels like you're in a massive tunnel that like goes on forever. It's multicolored sound. And I would say about a quarter of the people who experience that have tears in their eyes when they come out of it. So it's like they don't, and that's certainly, there's no like religious doctrine involved with it at all. It's just the sound and the music and the light and being in that space. And it really has a deep effect on people. So I'm amazed at it and when, with the artist and the musician and I were working on it, we were talking like, would it be possible to like manufacture a religious experience, a transcendental experience, a mystical experience? And that's what we came up with. And if you think about it, I mean, the architects who worked on the synagogue on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles and Grace Cathedral, they're trying to do the same thing, like provoke a deep human response to transcendence.
Great, thank you. I noted you had a background in Henry David Thoreau, so that sounds very Thoreau to me to hear that.
Thoreauvian, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, my doctoral advisor said that for like 1 year, I was one of the top 3 experts in the world on Henry David Thoreau's journal.
Great. I had a friend in grad school who was also doing a thesis on Thoreau, so I'm sure she'd love to meet you.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, I wanted to close it out and thank all 3 of our speakers today. Just wonderful examples of how you can take religious spaces and make them new again for people and get them excited about the space. So Cindy, do you want to mention anything before we close out today?
I'll just extend my thanks to each of you for sharing this today. It's a wonderful way to end our holiday program. Just beautiful work. Thank you so much. And just thank everyone for attending and remind everyone that we still have an auction and memberships and support CPF through our donation page on californiapreservation.org/give. That's it.
Yes, and I'll close out by saying also visit californiapreservation.org/bid. There's an auction ending tomorrow, so 8 p.m. 7:59:59 is when everybody has to make their final bid. So we hope you'll check it out. So thank you to the 3 panelists, and we will close this out. The recording will be available on YouTube or on our channel on Facebook, I guess. So thanks again, and
Thank you.
happy holidays to everyone. Happy New Year.
Yeah.